Alright, welcome to my first video revamping my YouTube channel. We're going to be looking at rendering cloth in a smooth, realistic-ish manner per popular vote. I've started with this in progress silk song reimagining here, so that you can kind of get an idea of the effects that we'll be hoping to get from the technique I'm going to show you, so that you don't have to just trust that the end is hopefully something you're interested in. So we're going to zoom in here on this section of her cloak here, this section here, and we're just going to do that portion because it'll take too long to do the whole thing. But let's get going. So for the cloth like this, it's not just a round shape like the leg here, very round shape, cylindrical. For this cloth, you're going to have a lot of shape variation, and you got to be careful with where you put your shapes. And when I say shapes, I'm talking about light and shadow shapes. So to start, we're going to grab the color of that cloth. We're just going to do a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated. Not very much. We're going to take the lasso tool, we're going to have it on fill, and we're going to start out drawing our shadow shape. And I promise this is not a cell shading video. I said I would do smooth rendering, and that's what we're going to do. But I'm showing you how I do it with cloth like this, because it's a little less straightforward. So I'm just drawing out my shadow shape. And if you need to understand how I chose this shape, so the arm pulls it up, so you have this curve here, so that's in shadow. That's going to cast a bit of a shadow here, and then it doesn't get pushed back up until over here. And the beautiful thing about this technique is nothing is permanent. It's all very easy to change later on, so you don't have to worry about messing it up. So I'm going to draw some shadow shapes over here. And the real reason you're using the lasso tool for this part of it is because it's very important from early on that you just start committing to shadow shapes. And with a cloth like this, you really need those shapes to kind of tell your brain how it's moving, how it's folding in on itself, as well as draping over other things. So if you zoom out, you can kind of get an idea of the shape that it's creating, how it's moving. And this is what I mean when I say it's non-committal. So I'm on one layer here. It's just a locked layer. So now I think that this portion is my screen's sideways, so I have to do some funky stuff to get the color picker where I want it. Okay, so now I'm going to take the original color, I'm going to take away some of this shadow shape because that was too much, right? So I want to pull this forward a bit to have it more in the light. I'm going to add a little bit here. Bring this fold over here in. A little bit of this ridge. Okay, something like that. And it really doesn't have to be perfect. The like last step of this is the blending portion that gets it kind of smooth all out. You can really get to play around with stuff during that phase, and it starts to just get a lot easier and make more sense. So we have that basic shadow in. So with cloth like this specifically, I'm gonna take my initial shadow color. I'm just going to go a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated again. Very subtle. This is not a shiny cloth, so that's definitely something to think about. And I'm not worrying about pattern or texture right now, other than, just kind of smooth. So I'm going to say this portion is folding down a little more, and then you kind of follow that pattern of which parts seem like they're folding in on each other a little more, which parts are facing away from the light more. And the nice thing with this is you kind of gradually get into darker darks and really only put them where they need to be, which with this style of rendering, your darkest darks are what end up being the piece that convinces the brain that this is real. Because it's not a shiny fabric, you're kind of relying on your darkest darks to be your key component of realism. Okay, so I added in some more shapes here. We're gonna go a little bit darker, a little more saturated. And for those of you that may not be aware, light, obviously it lightens things, but it also desaturates. So you want to do a little bit of saturation with your darks, not too much. It's very easy to go too heavy on some of these techniques. So now we're just putting in some of these darker spots, just where it feels like the cloth is pinching on itself more, to where you get a heavier exclusion of light. And you'll notice that this section here, so this is the underside of this. As of right now, I don't have it darker. Because it is just a flat plane, and it's going to have some bounce light, but now looking at it, I do want it to be a little darker. So I'm going to try really hard to get my picker to be where I want. You can't tell, but it's in the opposite place of where my finger is. It's very difficult. So I'm going to take that. I'm not going to color pick a darker one again. I'm just going to do a little bit darker and a little more saturated. And then for this, because I want this to be a little lighter, because I know that here is going to end up being a decent amount darker, and so I want this to kind of pop against that. So I'm going to add a shadow shape here, like this. And I don't think that's dark enough, so I'm going to hit undo. I'm going to hold down the selection tool so it brings the selection back, and then I'm going to go to my color square. I'm just going to make it a little bit darker, a little more saturated. Okay. So now, right up against that, I'm going to add a little bit more of a pinch in the fabric so that pops. And then because this is one of those, curvy folds that happen, I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow because that's its own shape. And you'll notice I'm not really following these lines. They're there, and sometimes I follow them. So like right here, I'm going to add a little bit of a darker bit to this line. Those lines don't represent every fold. They represent areas of a sharp fold, extra darkness, things like that. Okay, so now I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to look at it to see how does it read from a distance, because that's very important. Okay, so now we're at a point where I'm going to kind of start winging it with the blending to really start figuring out how I want this to look. And this is truly how I do it. I'm not doing anything different for this video. So I'm going to take my blending tool. So I use this flat brush here. I have it in one of my folders I made, but this exact brush is in Procreate's painting brush set. It's just the default flat brush. That's the brush I use for a lot of my rendering, my smooth rendering and whatnot. So I'm going to leave it at this size. I'm going to start here. This is the part that's bothering me the most. So I'm going to start just smoothing out this part of that underside of the fabric there. And basically what I'm doing here is where the shadow would kind of be fading around a smooth curve or something, that's where I'm going to blend it. And the nice thing about using this brush is it's you can use it as a push-pull, so I can push this out, I can pull that in, and that creates a bit of variety that's not as intentional as everything else, and it really, really makes it work. So I'm just gently going over some of these spots. If I had to give it a percentage, I'd say smooth out about a little more than half for sure, but you still want some of those hard edges to give some of those shapes you put in some of that definition, because it's huge in convincing your brain that it's functioning properly. But for instances where it's not a cast shadow and it's on a curved object, you're going to have some of that smooth. And now this brush will kind of pull in things around it, so I just had to get rid of some of this dark, almost black that pulled in. And at first that was really annoying to me, but then I kind of realized it almost works in creating that kind of natural variation that you're going to have that is really hard to do on purpose, for me at least. But it's certainly a good looking technique to have some of that variation. So I'm just pulling, going left and right, getting some of these shapes smoothed out. This is the quote-unquote render phase. You know, I'm not really changing the size of the brush here. I mean, I haven't changed the size of it yet. Okay, so I get to this point where I'm liking the amount of smoothing I've done. You know, I'm gonna zoom out. She has a very dark outfit, so your brain thinks like, oh, well, your shadows aren't dark enough because look at all this other dark, which in this case I believe is true, but just be careful because, you know, black clothing, you know, aka gray clothing, very, very dark shadows just because it starts dark. So you got to make sure that you don't make other things too dark because you're comparing it to that. But that's exactly what we're going to try to do here, is get our brain to accept a level of darkness. So we're going back to the lasso tool, making it darker. I'm going to lasso tool in some of these darks here. This little underside over here is definitely something we need to be quite a bit darker. That's getting very little light. You know, and our brain is still comparing this portion we're working on to the portion we're not working on. And so that's one reason why I've zoomed in so much, because I want to kind of look at this on its own. So I added those darks in, and now what I'm going to do, because this portion of the cloth, you know, it's wrapping around here, I need to try to curve this a little more, but very slightly. So I'm actually going to use just the brush itself, which it's that same brush I'm using for blending, the flat brush. You can see the size based on the cursor. I'm just going to leave it there and see how it goes. We're just going to try to pull in some darks right up here where the terminator would be. Okay, I'm gonna make it smaller. I'm gonna, it's pretty dark, I'll leave it there. But I'm gonna make it smaller just to kind of play with adding in some more of these folds here, because I do need some more darks. Now, this is what I was saying earlier, is the tiny areas of the darkest spots end up being what convinces your brain of, especially with fabric. It's very important with fabric, because if you look at fabric, you'll have a lot of variation in your shadow shapes and, you know, a lot of light and dark across the board. But you're always gonna have those little bits of super wrinkle that really fold in on themselves to the point of very dark. It's that very dark that your brain really is looking for to get a convincing wrinkle. And, you know, while we're here making clothing up from scratch without a reference, it's tough. And it becomes even more crucial to get that right. So over here, that's where it's all tucking in under this brooch thing that I put in. And now with these, they're folding in really hard on themselves on the right and not so much on the left. So then I take that blender and I just pull it out a bit. So then right here, this really looks like it's kind of folding in on itself. We're gonna make that more so. And then I made a little too much on this right side, so I'm actually gonna blend the opposite way for that. And then pull the tail out. Right here looks like maybe it's not quite right. So I'm gonna blend some of that lighter shade. And then same with right above that. So I don't like how that's, come on, color picker, you can do it. I don't like how this part here is kind of too rounded and curved. Takes away some of that sharpness I want from this cloak. So I'm gonna add back a nice sharp shape of that base color. Okay, I'm gonna zoom out. So now we're getting some of those micro folds. You can kind of see it. It's looking a little messy right here. And so it's at this point, if I was doing this, normally, if you will, it's at this point where I would actually combine. I only have 2 layers going, really. I have the lines and the colors. So right now, this is where I would normally combine those layers so that when I blend, it includes the lines. And that's really how I get that final touch. And at the risk of this entire painting going downhill, because I did this before I would, we're going to do it. I'm going to merge it down. So this is where I don't necessarily feel I need more darks or shadows, but I need to kind of play with the shape of it all. So I'm going to take my blender, make it a little bit bigger, almost bigger than I'm comfortable with, because it's about kind of playing with these shapes confidently and getting yourself to mess around with it instead of being too scared to make changes. So I'm going to take this blender. We're just going to start blending. Start pulling and pushing some of these. And now that I've started, I can say that my blender is too big, which is fine because it's super easy to change. So I'm going to pull that light color where I want it to be a little more prominent. I'm going to blend some of these pencil lines that are messing up my shapes a bit. And this is what really starts to smooth it. This is what's really making it that smooth render that everyone voted for. Once you get to this phase, because you really start to get that rendered look when you have less line. Make it a little smaller for this section because I want to lose some of these. And since it's locked, I can kind of pull in from that line on the outside to get a little bit of a darker situation over there without messing up the overall silhouette. So that's good. And here I'm going to actually kind of push against it a little bit. So, so far, we've used a standard default Procreate brush for any active painting and the same brush for blending. and the lasso tool. So nothing fancy going on. Okay, now the final thing here we'll do with this, just to check, it's really to check our shadows. So it's not a shiny cloth. I don't want it to be a shiny cloth, but I do have a decently strong light source. So I am going to now finally add in your quote-unquote highlights. Let's start with the lasso tool. Kind of pick where I feel like those shapes face the light the most. This is where I'll start to get rid of that outline in some spots. Kind of neglected her collar a bit because it's going to be interesting to really get right. And until my brain demands that I go to that section to fix it all, I'll leave it. So, zooming out, there's my shapes. If I don't blend it, it's got that shinier look, that hard cell shading. That's what I'm going for. So now I'm gonna make my blender, borderline too big to start. So make it a little smaller. With this, the side of your shape, in this case the light shape, that's farthest from the light source gets blended the most. And that's the idea, that the beginning of it is more or less like cast shadows coming in, right? And then on the other side, it's where the light's slowly bouncing more and more away from that. And that's the trick. The light is always bouncing and moving around everywhere, so it's quite the tricky bit to get it to look like it's properly hitting a material as well as bouncing around. But light bounces off of brighter, shinier things much more readily than darker things. Darker things absorb more of it. Okay. So that's looking pretty good. We got that. I like the overall look. It's got that kind of like Spawn, Batman cape, tons of fold look that's almost nonsensical, but you're like, yeah, that works. The only thing that I'm wanting is this section on the right, where it comes into the little clip here. I feel like it wants to be a little darker because it is still curving in and then facing away from the light source. But it's very subtle, and since I've already put shapes there, I don't want to color over them. So I'm going to take the darkest color. I'm going to take my flat brush, because this is like a layering brush. It's like a marker. Now, if I take the darkest color that already exists, and I do this, it doesn't take from that. That's the key, because it's going to layer over everything. I don't want it to make those darks less dark. And because I'm going to use the lasso tool later to tackle this brooch and everything, we can be exact later, so I'm going to let it bleed into that to really get this part to be darker. So I'm just coloring over this whole area to darken it. And I'm not pressing hard, so I can layer it slowly zoom out. Okay, that's looking better. However, now this feels like I want even darker darks. You're gonna have some serious light exclusion right here where it comes into this. Final touch, lasso tool, some of these folds. Every fold is coming from this clip. And then because it sits on top of it, we're gonna do this bit of line here. Okay, nice. Do a little bit more to the collar and then we'll be done. A little lesson here. The collar wants to be a little darker because it's not actually facing anything. So it didn't get much highlight, but it also didn't get much shadow because it's not facing completely away. It's on the trickier side. And I'm just doing shapes with this idea that it's kind of wrinkled, kind of, frilly, not a whole lot. And, this kind of using the lasso tool just gets your brain to immediately start seeing these shapes. It's a lot easier than trying to slowly shade shapes with a brush and find that, because shapes in a stylized painting like this, they're very important, and you got to get your brain to see those shapes early on and commit to them, or you get kind of a muddied look. Nothing's very definite. And then if you think, oh, that's too harsh of a shape, that's where you get to come back and blend it nice and soft, where you feel like you didn't lose that shape, but it's not so harsh. And then I'm thinking this is technically going to like overlap in some capacity. But I'm just going to test that out, make it nice and dark. It's overlapping, but it doesn't make sense. There's no button, and I don't want to add a button, so I'm going to undo that. And we're just going to say this is one bit of fabric, like a neck hole rather than fabric that folds over. Okay. Alright, there you go. For this fabric, this color, nothing fancy. Just focusing on shapes of light and dark, and make sure you zoom out enough to get an idea of what it's actually looking like. And I like that the cloak and the way I'm doing these folds, kind of very linear, lots of this going on. It's very in contrast to these shapes next to it here. Her body is very vertical and this is all very horizontal, so that's fun. Was that on purpose? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know if I'm that cool yet, but it looks good. So there you go. My first YouTube video and my long-awaited return. I've been waiting a long time to return, waiting for the perfect moment, and it wasn't coming, so we just made it happen. And now at the end of the video, I am realizing I didn't fill in her earrings. Oops. But hey, that's what these tests are for. Well, thank you for watching. Hopefully this was useful. If it wasn't useful, give me tons of shit in the comments. YouTube's all about shitting on people in the comments, really. So, make it happen. Alright. See you guys next time.